Okay, so we're going to transition here from Unit 1 and start going into Unit 2, and we'll talk in a little bit about just a reminder of some of the things that have happened for the development of Canada. We're looking at specifically a timeline that's from 1774 moving forward, and there will be some significant changes, obviously, and they're more the kinds of changes that start to kind of really give us an idea of the Canada that is eventually going to come to be. So we start recognizing the beginning of some things. So like an example of that could be the Métis Nation. We know that there's 3 different groups of an Indigenous groupings in Canada. We have the Inuit, we have the First Nations, and then we have the Métis, that they each have different origins, different culture, different heritage, a different place negotiated within Canada. This one may be less so specifically, but we'll end up looking at that. So what I've got here are a list of some of the changes that will be part of this section that we'll be discussing and cover. And it looks at kind of the different kinds of trends or things that are going to start to kind of shift. So if I just go through this list with you, you would write this out. Because again, when you take your own notes, you'll retain more of that information. You internalize it a bit more. That's why I'm not typing this out and giving it to you as a handout. So my effort here is to help you kind of think carefully through the list here. So different kinds of social issues that start changing, some social trends, like we're going to have an increase pretty soon in population where they're starting to open up settlement territory west, which up until this point has been blocked. It's been a cause of conflict for the colonists that they've wanted territory open to expand and settle west, but that land has always been set aside as First Nations reserve, but eventually the migration of movement of people is going to mean that they need to create more space for these people to move to. So there'll be an increase in immigration coming. Some of them are going to be the loyalists that are moving up, and others will be immigrants. Not necessarily, like also colonists, but immigrants in the sense that they come directly from a home country, not are part of the second or third generation of people that had already been colonizing this territory, okay? We're also going to have an expansion of the European settlements, so they're going to start opening further and further west. Because you're going to open up that expansion west, that means that there are people that have traditionally used those lands, and so there'll be the dislocation of the First Nations people. We also know that we've got the French fur traders, we've got First Nations people that are part of that trade and trapping with for the French people. Then we end up with a Métis Nation, and that's going to start developing, and it's a bit west of what we've been talking about as well. So the origin of the Métis people. You'll also have the Francophones, so the French-speaking population. Some of them move outside of that Quebec territory, look to get the free land in other areas. And so we don't only have French in Quebec, we have it across Canada in different numbers, of course, but there is a migration of some of the French people moving. We have an end of slavery, and so we have a Black population that's moving north, looking for places to settle, and so then there's conflict as well with that, where they've previously been known as slaves, that idea of gaining independence, but being socially recognized as an equal as part of that process. We'll have the beginning of some cities, so not necessarily those less developed kinds of forts, but some real established cities that have strong foundations. We'll end up having factories. So there's kind of the mechanization, the development of the Industrial Revolution, things like that. So we have women and children that are employed in these factories. But a really big part of this whole story is there is a growing divide between the class system, lower class, middle class, higher class, or upper. And the ethnic divisions, you'll have Black people, we've still got the First Nations people, we've got the French speaking, and we've got the English speaking. So we have the divisions, and the question here is whether we segregate or integrate is part of the question that the British need to solve, and we'll we kind of can foresee what some of that is going to be about. There are also some science developments or technological advancements. So if you watch the video about the development of the railway or the steam train, the telegraph, journalism, communications, things like that, those are elements of technological advancements. Steam engine, transportation, the mechanization of industry, so the growth of factories and things like that, mass producing things. The telegraph is great for communication. The cameras even developed early on, so then we'll have some primary document photos of the early settlers. There will be a list to come of the specific people who should get honorable mention in this time period of 1774 onward, in that early years of what will become Canada's Confederation. We'll go through those people as we come across them. Some specific economic trends, and economics or economy is related to, employment, generation of wealth, what people have, that kind of stuff. So economic trends, we're going to have 2 rivalry fur trading companies that are still at work in the area across Canada. So they'll have to come to a head and see who will win out in that battle. We have some land grants that are given out to some wealthy people because of their position or as recognition of their contribution to the war that helped Britain gain this territory. Grants of land given out, and again, which also leads to that displacement of people that are habitating those areas. We, across the country, have the development more of that infrastructure. So these are the structures of the land. So the railroad that's going to connect that sea to sea, east to west. The bridges, things like that. Also, as far as trading goes, or just the allowance up and down past that parallel 49 border with America, we'll have to have a more established relationship with America. For a while, it's still volatile. There's still tension because there is an invasion from the Americans at a time. But after a period of time, they realize that they're pretty settled in their locations and ways of things, and they come to an agreement to just cohabitate and share this North American territory. We also have that gold rush that happens in BC, which again is part of the reason why you needed that railroad that connects us to the West Coast, because they wanted to make sure that the Americans didn't try to expand and kind of cut us off from that sea access by taking British Columbia. It was a colony at the time, so it did exist. It was populated by some people, but wasn't part of an idea of Canada or what was early Confederation at the very beginning. And through all of this, and this is, a phrase that's very well discussed in our current days, this idea of colonization, colonial policies, that there are a lot of things that exist in our day-to-day, our current political and social issues, even economic issues, are a result of colonization. And a lot of times the word is used in a negative way because it has, colonization has led to lesser existence, I guess we could say, of some groups. Colonization has favored some and not others. So in that regard there, we do reflect back on it and look at the negative consequences, or specifically, the outcomes of that. And it leads to even things related to our current justice system when we're talking about overpopulation or overrepresentation of First Nations people that are part of the criminal justice system, or even things like poor health, poor living conditions, all sorts of things that are specific to First Nations people, as an example. because a place was created specifically for certain types of people. Certain people were favored, other people were kind of removed out of the way, seen as impediments to the progress that was made. And so there was a podcast that I was listening to this morning, and they were just talking about this concept of privilege. And there was a man that was talking and said that, his ancestors came from Ireland. They were Irish Catholic. And comparing himself and his advantage to other people who may have been descendants of original inhabitants of the territory historically in North America, he equated it to this idea of a race, and that his ancestors had already been part of an ongoing race towards progress, whereas other people were hindered from joining that race for a long time. This idea that some were favored and others were not. So the restrictions that were eventually placed on people, things like the Indian Act, which we'll talk about, actually kept people behind progress, kept them from progressing, restricted them. There was the restrictions. And that lasted a long time, and the consequences still are being felt today. And so when we're talking about this idea of colonial policies, we have to understand that this is the reasons why people made the decisions they did at the time, who they were making those decisions for, who they were excluding those decisions from affecting or benefiting. But the whole goal here is leading towards the progression of this North American continent, or this North American experiment. Somebody in class was saying, Jackson Furby was making a comment about, what they should have done if, we wanted a better outcome in the end. We can't really play those types of should have games, because of course we do know hindsight. We know what the country has become. We know some of the steps that have led us to that. At the time, we can only appreciate and accept the reasons behind the decisions that certain people made these choices then, and hopefully look at the positives. We speak English, we have a great culture, we've developed into a country of great diversity and openness and support, and we use our money to support all sorts of social programs. We are recognized as one of the best quality of living countries in the world, one of the most developed, one of the richest. We're part of the G7. We play quite a significant role in helping support the other areas of the world, because we are so benefited by what our history has led us to. So we have to look that there has got to be some positives to that, but then of course we know that the negatives are more greatly felt by some people that were more affected by this idea of colonization. That's the background to some of the stuff that we're about to cover in this unit 2, okay? That's that background. Now, in discussing that stuff, I wanted to bring up here, and I have a second page actually to look at it. I was kind of surprised to see that some people had not yet heard about this idea of this thing called the Buffalo Declaration. This has been put forward by, there's 4 members of Parliament. 4 members of Parliament. I don't know how many ridings there are in Alberta, but the fact that there's only 4 is kind of, it's a minimal movement. If you think as well, there's 330 plus seats in the House of Commons that represent Canadians, and there's only 4 of them that have put forward this idea. But it's this idea that Alberta isn't getting a fair share. It's an idea that the established relationship of Alberta to Canada is unsatisfactory. And there is an interesting idea that they have in their approach to this. It's the idea that if we look at, the federal government, we initially had these 4 provinces that made up Canada. And different colonies joined in. They initially were different colonies. They had their own government representation. And they kind of came together and had these negotiations to say, wouldn't it benefit us to have a unified nation? And then we could start having a sense of national pride. We can start looking at the expansion and development, settlement of our country and be the decision makers, as opposed to relying on Britain to lead us in all of these things. So there was that first establishment of a unified Canada. But with that, they had to negotiate what the role of the colonies were, or provinces. And what's interesting here, if we're thinking of the federal governments out there in Ontario and Alberta's over here, and we know that Alberta has for a long time been rich in resource. We know that they're struggling, again, because there's been a downturn in the value of those resources right now, and that we're also, as a kind of global society, switching to these ideas of trying to use and focus our attentions on more sustainable uses of resources, or thinking about the long-term benefits. So Alberta has been suffering. There has been, no doubt, some issues there. And as a result of that, the provincial government itself is making a lot of cuts. You know, there are cuts to education, cuts to nursing, cuts to the funding of doctors. They just announced yesterday that they're closing 20 provincial parks. All sorts of things that are really having an effect on the individuals that are there. Now, we know, we've talked previously about this idea of equalization, that this whole country is benefited by the value of resources across the territory, and it kind of gets pooled together, and then it gets shared back out to different locations that don't have as much to rely on of their own resources. And so, as an example, Alberta has only ever given money to the federal government for that redistribution of the wealth to other locations, like one of them being Quebec or the Maritimes. And that redistribution is meant to pay for the social programs, so to help pay for education or for health facilities or anything that is a social program, welfare, that kind of stuff, so that it's not that province alone that needs to rely on supporting itself, because we are a federation, we are a country united. We share these resources. But the interesting point, and I'll change to a different color here, that this Buffalo Declaration makes, is that Alberta was not meant to be a child of a parent being Canada. And we'll get into that when we look at Confederation and the agreement to come together as one nation. It didn't mean that these separate colonies then gave up all of their autonomy or decision-making power on their own. All it meant was that they would benefit working together as a group and being unified as a group. And in that establishment of the Confederation, they set out the rules, or the responsibility for federal government and provincial government, and they just have a separation of powers. But it wasn't intended to be this concept that Canada was the parent over a child. And so these MPs are making the point that it seems like, a parent isn't recognizing them as being an autonomous part of that federation. And the other part is, we've talked about this concept of mercantilism, where a home country gets resources from a colony. So the resources come to the home country, and then merchandise or goods go back to be consumed by the colony. That was the whole idea of the home country gaining wealth, right? So what their comparison here is that they feel like Canada is using Alberta as a colony, that it's only taking the resources and the wealth from those resources to Canada for redistribution, but they're questioning what the reciprocal back result is. What are they getting in response or as a consequence of that, or what are they getting in return? And so once we finally get into this stuff, as we're about to, we're going to start looking then too about the idea of resources, because when they're initially thinking about all of these concepts and what provinces would be responsible for and that kind of stuff, they're thinking about the resources that are attainable, like forestry, like land settlement, like water access and that kind of stuff. That there was, no real concept yet, other than the gold mining, of any kind of, natural gas or underland resources to the extent that we're well aware of it now. So we'll end up talking about the evolution of the use of the resource revenues. We'll end up talking about that and how that's evolved over time. And again, this idea of equalization, of the reciprocal, provinces that have in our country that contribute to the big pot, and that the have-not provinces then can have their social programs provided for with that. Someone brought up in class here that Alberta is one of the provinces that's never received any payments from that equalization payment. But to counter that as well, Alberta also has never paid, they don't pay provincial tax. They don't have a tax local that would help fund education, nursing, doctors, that kind of stuff. And they kind of refuse to for some reason. So that's part of the conversation as well. And that even so, despite that kind of seemingly one-directional flow of wealth, that Alberta is still one of the provinces in Canada that has the highest per capita wealthy people across Canada. So the lowest levels of poverty across Canada. So there is always a big picture to look at, never just a few talking points. But that's the background to this Buffalo Declaration. So we're about to learn where this Canada comes from, those very original discussions, and how they chose to create that union. And it leads to things like today, that we're aware of these things. So it is all very relevant. And like I said before, with history, I know that it's not everybody's interest. You either have a high or a low level of interest. And as we learn new content, if you don't have an interest in it and you're working at a low level of interest, the only way that I can help you acquire it is if I can connect it to your prior knowledge. We have to look at new content and connect it to something so that it has a chance to stick in your brain. And that's what this is. We're talking prior knowledge. You're aware of things that are happening today in Canada. There's a lot of conflict right now, a lot of tension, not just Alberta, but also the issue that's happening right now with the blockades, or the issue of land autonomy or sovereignty with the Wet'suwet'en group. So there's a lot of things that are currently happening today. They are indirect consequences of the decisions that are about to happen in Unit 2. And so that's what this background is here. But there's a lot of things that we see as relevant and that need to be resolved still today, that they are the consequences, not necessarily intended consequences, but still the consequences or the outcome of decisions that are about to be made in Unit 2. So that's kind of an intro to where we're going, okay?